I made the classic mistake of thinking my world was the world. And I thought that there were more people like me than there were. And I think that it's a really easy mistake for people to make.
Of course, we've all done it.
Right? But I forgot that, in the words of, LBJ, the first rule of politics is learn how to count. I forgot that I had to do some counting. 5 or 6 years ago, I found the idea of doing that so scary. So scared of being wrong. So scared of having my view of the world shaken up by new information. Getting that bit older, I'm like, okay, like not only is this not scary, you're going to have to suck it up, buttercup, and look at the ways in which you've been wrong and look at the ways in which your own social world has blinded you, because if you don't, you're going to lose.
I first met today's guests in 2010. It was a long time ago. I even had cheekbones. She was 18 years old. It was the University College London occupation in opposition to a 300% hike in tuition fees. Maybe you remember. She has been integral to the journey we've had here on Novara Media in the last decade. So I've known her both politically and professionally. She's always been one of the most impressive people I know. And that was true from the first few weeks that we got to know one another right through to today. I'm really happy about today's conversation because it's about her debut book, Minority Rule, Adventures in the Culture War. At the heart of this book, its hypothesis, is the claim that many of the ideas which were generated during that period when we first met one another around the left, around identity, around meaning and around power and how to counteract those things, have, rather surprisingly, become the ultimate tool in the hands of the right as they accumulate more economic, political, and even cultural power than ever before. It's a powerful idea, and I think there's a lot to it. So with no further ado, I'd like to say hello to Ash Sarkar. Welcome to Downstream.
This is so weird.
Why is it weird?
Because, one, I'm used to this being either a conversation or I'm asking the questions. 2, this is about something that I've written. And 3, in the back of my mind, I'm asking myself, will the audience feel like this is just a puff piece? Because obviously we work together, we've known each other for many years, and this is our shared baby of an interview series. So give me a hard time.
I'll try. There was a moment where I tweeted the image of the book, which is here, my well-thumbed copy, as you can see. This is not the actual cover. I tweeted a picture of it and I said, this is fantastic, it's going to help reconfigure the left. But then I suppose if you were a skeptic, you would say, well, what else would you be declaring about the book? You're not going to say, it's rubbish, don't read it.
Imagine if you did.
Yeah, imagine. But I do believe it's a very important book at a very important time. Yeah, the first 100 pages, I think, are probably some of the best non-fiction I've read in a while. Which is, and that doesn't mean the rest of it's not good. But it's very hard with non-fiction in particular just to get an even, especially with current affairs, because you're just going to care about some things more than others, right?
I think so. And I think that the first 100 pages, there's an introduction where I think I go through an argument which you make, which is that everyone is black-pilled now. There is such a profound loss of trust and breakdown of the social contract that no matter who you are in this country, whether you're a homeowner or a renter or you live in Barnsley or you live in Hackney, you feel like hard work isn't rewarded, that there's no point having trust in politicians, and though you consume an awful lot of media, you can't trust what it is you're hearing. And I think that resonates a lot with what you've said of everyone is black-pilled now, and that is a left and right-wing phenomenon. And then the first chapter is called How the I Took Over Identity Politics, which is the one where I think most of my friends are going to get a bit pissed off because it is fundamentally a criticism of the left. The rest of the book is really about right-wing identity politics and how the right mobilize identity politics. But I realized that I couldn't write that without looking at the origins of some of these ideas and tactics, which really originate from us.
Yeah, I said that as well on X. It's going to piss off a lot of people on the left, right, centre, none of the above. And obviously you get lots of right-wing people going, oh my God, minority rule, presumably Ash Sarkar's calling for, God knows what,
The Bengali Caliphate.
brown and black people to form some kind of, woke Politburo to oversee the country, with Ash Sarkar as the Doge.
Bruv, we'd never get there on time for the Politburo meeting. It ain't happening.
Yeah, I think there'd be an uprising pretty quickly. But that's not at all what you've written about. And actually some of those people would probably find themselves nodding in agreement with at least some of the points you're making, because they're critical points about the left. And they'd be thinking, well, I thought that was her, but she's criticizing it. So starting with identity, what's wrong with identity as a basis for politics? You refer to it in the book as a cage. What do you mean?
Well, I suppose the first thing to say is that identity is always important. The question is how important and to what extent is it going to shape your political horizons? All of us are interested in who we are and how we're perceived. That's just a part of being human. And I know that, I'm not exactly a biologist or, a student of evolutionary history, but my theory is the reason why that's so important is because look at us as humans. We've got no claws, no fangs, no real means of defending ourselves in the wild. The thing that we've got is sociality. So of course, who we are and who we're perceived to be is incredibly important. The problem with a focus on identity and this question of who am I and who are you is that it, I think, bakes in a sense that we have opposing interests, that attention is a finite resource and that we're always in competition with each other for it. And I think that it breaks down our collective power, which is, I think, the only tool humans have ever had to transform society. It's one class becoming big enough and strong enough to overthrow the one above it. And that's why, this is a Marxist book in the sense that Marx's theory of historical change is really important. And that's sort of the starting point. Why hasn't the working class gotten big enough and strong enough to overthrow the bourgeoisie? And the thing that I'm looking at is the rise of identity politics as part of why that's the case.
Is it a big part?
I'd say it's a pretty big part. And, when I talk about the rise of identity politics, I'm not just talking about the identity politics of the left. I'm also talking about the way in which social media gives us, tailored feeds. It makes us feel that what we're paying attention to is the entire world. Obviously, that's not the case. It creates a competitive attitude towards attention because you're literally competing with other people to amass a bigger following. And I think that the way in which identity is being understood as founded in notions of irreducible difference, right? You being Iranian, me being Bengali, that's too different for us to find any kind of common cause, or maybe it's gender, or maybe it's sexuality or whatever. That's a product of neoliberalism. And it's also something which is deepened by our economic conditions. Our economic conditions are making us, I think, more hostile and suspicious of one another.
So you think the genesis of all of this stuff, left-wing identity politics, you think that starts presumably in the 80s, 90s? Where does this begin? Because of course you get the movements in the 1960s, liberation movements, etc., and the formal right-wing critique of this stuff would be this is a bad thing. Obviously, we think there are very good aspects to it too. And it starts, 60 years ago. Where does that kind of date, the 60s, can sort of sit in your thinking?
So the 60s and 70s are really important because I think when you look at the movements of that time, of course, they were flawed and of course they weren't perfect, but they showed a really different attitude to navigating questions of identity. So the term identity politics was coined by the Combahee River Collective, and they released this really famous Combahee River Collective statement. And their idea of identity politics was fundamentally anti-capitalist, and the importance of identity was that it gave them a vantage point on the labour market. So being Black American women, that gave them a point of view on how capitalism worked. That was the point. It wasn't that, we've won the identity Olympics because we've got all these intersections. It was, this gives us a sense of what's really going on here. I also look at the Black Panthers and how they worked across different identity groups. They really didn't think that language was that important. They weren't, hung up on what kind of symbols or language, poor whites from Appalachia were using. They were like, okay, you're anti-capitalist, we're anti-capitalist, let's go. They didn't care about the fact that the idea of being a panther was being appropriated and adopted by other groups. So when delegates from the Viet Cong, essentially, came for a conference with the Black Panthers, they said, you're Black Panthers, we're Yellow Panthers. And that was a moment of celebration rather than you're taking something from us. So that's how it was in the 60s and 70s. I think what happens in the 80s is that you've got the rise of the neoliberal political subject, atomized, competitive, and also a product of what neoliberalism is doing to the institutions which would produce class consciousness, which I argue are industrial labour and what that does geographically, holding communities together, the trade union movement, and council housing, particularly in the UK. Actually existing communism, also important. It means that these socialist ways of understanding the world are powerful, if not dominant, in Western countries as well. Along comes Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, and they're just smashing it to bits with a hammer. And my argument is that they're doing so deliberately. They're doing this not just because they're ideologically opposed to things like council housing or organised labour, but because it produces a new kind of political subject. Margaret Thatcher famously said, economics are the method, the object is to change the heart and soul. And I think that she did that. So then the identity politics that we get outside of that sort of crushing, bashing machine, it's profoundly inflected by ideas of suspicion, individualism, competition. And the fact that the left is so attached to these really individualistic models of identity politics, I think it's hamstringing us. Like it's utterly hamstringing us. But we don't want to give it up because we think it means betraying the cause of anti-racism. I actually think it's kind of the opposite. I think that this means that the cause of anti-racism will be doomed to fail.
Do you think identity politics is making racism worse or has made racism worse? There's an argument which is that the legacy of... Now, look, I'm not saying I think that. This is what we're going to discuss over the next 90 minutes or whatever. But there's one strain of thinking, which is the major legacy of DEI, identity politics, over the last 15 years is actually the re-emergence of white race consciousness. That's how maybe somebody on the far right would put it. They would say, thank you, great, you did us such a big favour. Where would you sit on that?
I think that's a really interesting question. And listening to it, I wish that I'd addressed it in the book directly. Did it make racism worse? It depends what you think racism is. So if you look at racism as something which is about cultural and social norms, I think that the rise of woke politics, DEI, what I call liberal identity politics, has definitely generated a backlash, right? That's, I just think, undeniable. That's not just to do with racism. There was a quote in the Financial Times, which was someone who, worked in quite a high-powered corporate job, boasting that the end of woke and the return of Trump meant that he could use words like retard and pussy again in the workplace. So there's definitely something about this kind of liberal identity politics, the way it's played out through workplaces and HR departments, and there being this sort of desire to return to, obnoxious, offensive language. What kind of impact did liberal identity politics have on what we might call structural or institutional racism? Really the answer is none. Like had no impact on whether or not you would be more likely to be stopped and searched because you're black, or more likely to be picked up in an illegal immigration raid, or the kind of services, care services in particular, which are available to disabled people. So I think it was Talman Joseph Smith who tweeted this recently. He's an economics reporter for the NYT, which is that all of the gains of woke were cultural and representative and linguistic.
So what were the gains of woke? And what dates are we looking at here? Like woke, when, not when it starts, but like over what period, and what were the gains?
Well, I think you really have to look at the period in between the shooting of Trayvon Martin by George Zimmerman, which is when the first emergence of BLM happens. And I guess Trump's inauguration. Those are the dates that I'd say you'd have to look at. During that time, other things happen, including the Me Too movement, the famous trans tipping point, which I think, that's not that, oh, wow, life's great for trans people. It's actually trans people have reached a level of heightened visibility. And that people who have made it through universities where, we met at university. That's a time for political exploration and working things out. And that may be some of these, norms around language policing. They go from university into the workplace because that's what those individuals are doing. They're going from the university into the workplace. So I think those are the dates that you'd be looking at for, the heyday of liberal identity politics.
I think as well, there's that precursor moment. For me, it was interesting. I started my PhD in 2010, and prior to that...
Riding in on a penny farthing.
Oh, yeah. Dressing rather strangely, as you probably remember when we first met. But I remember, so 2008, 2009, there was very little of this stuff. And even in 2010, you have the student movement, opposition to austerity. It is very either identikit radical social democrat focusing on the economics, or it's anarcho, libertarianism.
Yeah, I thought if we occupied one more branch of Santander, revolution would be around the corner. My theory of change was not super well developed.
What was really interesting is you had the means, or you had the strategies and the tactics actually, which was like that, very radical, occupying stuff, but the demand was incredibly sort of vanilla and social democratic, which is stop tax avoidance, which was, by the way, very, very valuable and very successful in some ways. But then it's something I noticed. I was studying until maybe 2014, 2015. You're going to be a much better authority on this because you were an undergraduate over that same period. Just strange things started to happen. And I remember the first time going into a university occupation, and then literally before it started, somebody saying, this is now a safe space. We've got these rules. They weren't, and I have no problem with rules. I have no problem with a space being safe, obviously, but they weren't formulated amongst the people being there. They weren't done in an inclusive way, which is a word everybody loves, but very few people practice. And actually, it was very alienating. And there was a very clear, and I'm not suggesting that it was entirely causal, but there was a very clear correlation between a vanguard of people behaving like that and actually lots of people just becoming quite disinterested quite quickly.
I think there's truth in it, but also I remember things not always being great in those movements or those spaces. I remember at the university occupation where we first met, it being really hard as a young woman to be taken seriously by men, and also to have your personal space respected. I remember, both me and a friend would be followed into the toilets we were trying to use by a man who was trying to hit on us. And so that sense
Was he a student or
I think he was a bit older.
Okay.
He was a bit older. And at that time, it felt really difficult if you were a woman and if you were a person of colour to say, these things impact how I'm treated socially, and I would like that to change. And I remember when I was in my, I guess early 20s, coming across the language of liberal identity politics, whether it was cultural appropriation or microaggressions or white privilege even, and going, fuck yeah, this describes my experience. And it felt like a light being switched on. And then I felt a bit empowered because here's this language, it's coming into vogue. And when I say, hey, this thing that's kind of messed up about our social interaction, it's a product of white privilege, people would understand that. I felt hugely powerful. Now, I don't think that I was always right in how I used that language. Who is in their early 20s?
Of course.
But I think that lots of people of colour, lots of women, lots of other kinds of minorities as well, found that language gave them social power, maybe for the first time ever. And then the problem is that it becomes addictive and you use it everywhere and you use it all the time because it becomes a little bit of a cheat code. So you can kind of cheat the messiness of interacting with other people, cheat the messiness of political contestation by appealing to these concepts or trying to bring in rules. One of the things that I try and, this is a very liberal IDPOL term, one of the things I try and hold space for in the book, or, kind of bring in, is that there is nuance here. Just because these ideas have been harmful and just because they've been misapplied, it doesn't mean that everyone was coming from a bad intentioned place.
Yeah.
But you also have to be honest with yourself about why these concepts felt so attractive. It's because it empowered your voice in a way that without those concepts, you wouldn't have been able to sort of get to the top of the attention queue.
I do see what you're saying, but you mentioned the experience of being at university occupations, Occupy. In those spaces, I understand, like I say, the idea and the necessity of a safe space, which should be, by the way, mutually agreed and sort of formulated democratically. It wasn't. But then there was this imposition of that kind of politics. Yeah, of course, when you've got 200 complete strangers together, you're going to need some rules, right? For instance, at the UCL occupation, there was no drinking. It was a dry space.
Was it?
It was meant to be.
Loads of people were drinking.
But in a way, that's the best way to do it, right? You can do it, just don't do it so people can see you, and don't be, outrageously drunk, right? That's.
I think I may have been outrageously drunk.
That's a manageable situation. Basically, people were going to be sleeping there. You didn't want, others up till 3, 4 in the morning drinking 10 beers. Perfectly sensible. But then, of course, it's about transposing some of those rules into a sort of liminal space, which has radicalized lots of people. By the way, that happened on both sides of the Atlantic, in the US, in the UK, in all kinds of places, and saying, actually, we're now going to try and create a society along those lines.
Just on the point about not wanting to throw the baby out with the bathwater, I think it's really good that if you call me a packy in the workplace, you will be reprimanded. I think it's really good.
Well, here you'd be fired, right?
You'd be fired.
That's gross misconduct.
Yeah, right, that's gross.
There's no warning.
But the thing I'm saying is that it wasn't always like that in the workplace for people of colour and for women and for various other minorities. I mean, I remember working in a pub when this was around the time where we first met, and I really, really liked working there. Loved working there. But things would happen where I'd go, this is completely mad, and there's no shared language to express how mad it is. One is the landlady, who I really, really liked and gotten well with. She wanted me to serve tea out of gollywog teacups, and I was like, I'm not going to do that. That's insanely racist. Her partner one day brought back a painting that he got from a car boot sale or something of black children holding up watermelon slices to, their mouths. And it's okay, again, deeply racist.
How did you do that? How did you say that? Or did you just not say anything?
Oh no, for the gollywog tea set, I said, I'm not doing that.
Yeah.
I was like, that's really racist. These are gollywogs. And she was like, Ash, they're actually called gollies, actually. And I was like, the problem isn't me saying the final part of the word. For her partner, I didn't say anything. But there was also this guy who we worked with who actually wanted to become a police officer, who was incredibly racist against, Roma and travellers. But also was just sexually harassing every woman. I remember at one point, I think he was bent down trying to get something from underneath the bar, and he would just sort of trying to take a peek up between your legs. That's the kind of thing he'd do. And that was kind of what workplaces were like before some of these concepts becoming widely understood. So this is what I mean by don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. There are some good things that an enhanced awareness of language and behaviour have done, right? I think it's really good that it's broadly agreed that you can't, look up between a woman's legs at work anymore. Great. But the problem with the focus on language is that there is no, you can have a workplace, take this one, right? Let's say we have a workplace where everyone uses the exact kind of language, the exact right framework, and everyone's very, very mindful about microaggressions. That wouldn't stop us being really exploitative in our employment contracts. You know what I mean? It just wouldn't. I just wouldn't call you a slur while I was underpaying you.
Yeah, which is basically, that's been the default of progressive workplace over the last 15 years, right?
Oh yeah.
You will get poorer, but I'll be very mindful of microaggressions. Here's a quote from page 46 in the proof copy, so it may not be the final edit. Identity, and this is, Ash, this is like TNT. This is going to blow some people up. Identity politics has become a largely middle-class preoccupation due to its spread in elite universities. We've already said that. The ideology isn't being shared in a context where the goal is to get people to work together towards the goal of social transformation. It's in the competitive yakety-yak of arts and humanities seminars.
I am an arts and humanities grad, by the way, so I'm in this picture.
Yeah, this is anthropology, right, at the very highest level. That's the same incubation tank that I sprang from, one where the stakes were no higher than your own personal academic status, and the goal was to prove how much smarter you were than everybody else. The overeducated and insecure probably aren't the best people for creating a healthy political culture. It's not exactly the most useful approach to take if you're trying to organise people to work collectively. Now, there are people who don't like you, don't like me, don't like Novara, hate the left. They'll hear that or read that. I hope they read it. They should buy the book. They'll be jumping for joy. They'll be saying, she gets it. Finally, somebody on the left, they get it. When did that realization hit you?
Oh, it really took some time. Like, it really, really took some time. And it actually took talking a lot with my husband, who I think because he comes from a small town near Barnsley and his brother lives in a small town in Yorkshire still. And him and his brother have had very, very different life paths, right? So obviously, my husband moved to London, got a brown and bougie girlfriend, now brown and bougie wife. His brother did a lot of travelling, didn't go to uni, works in a factory in Huddersfield, lives nearby. So very different life experiences, very different life worlds. And I think that him sort of being a bit between, being part of, this, graduate without a future class in London, but also having this connection through his family to a world that wasn't like that, meant that where I was maybe a bit blind to the biases and preoccupations of the graduate-dominated left, he wasn't. And so at home, we'd be talking about this all the time, and he would say, well, this focus on policing language, what terms people use, what they're not allowed to use, what's appropriation, what wasn't. This is university graduates who are middle class telling everyone else what they should think and say. And when he said that, I was so resistant to it at first.
When did he say that?
Oh, this was, I guess,
For the first time?
Maybe 2 or 3 years ago. So I was definitely writing the book and we were having this conversation at the same time. And I was very resistant to it at first. And then I gave it some thought. And this is also the great thing about writing a book rather than fast turnaround articles and videos, is that you can really be with your thoughts and not feel a sense of threat from other people's judgment because you're just having to work it out by yourself. I really thought about it, and I thought about language policing, and I thought about the emphasis on discourse. This fits into that discourse, therefore it's problematic. I was like, shit, this is what I was trained to do as a literature student. I was trained to look at language, pick it apart, look for the problems, look for the contradictions, and then leave them there. Now, I think that's valuable when you're looking at a novel or you're looking at a piece of philosophy or whatever. But if you're trying to work together to a shared goal, being hyperfixated on language and problems and contradictions doesn't help you get there. It's like we're trained to say, no, rather than, yeah, let's go for it. If you are a political agent, you have to be a, yeah, let's go for it person. And I don't think I always am. I think sometimes I can be a no but person. And writing this book, I've tried to discover my inner, yeah, fuck it, go for it.
Your inner risk-loving self. There's an interesting story actually about, it's now the biggest steel-making firm in the United States. I think it's called Nuclear. And up until the 80s, they were a very average firm. And then they make this decision to move to, I think, one of the Carolinas. And they have a whole new model, and they hire farmers. And they say the farmers don't know how to make steel, but they know how to get up at 6 a.m., and they know how to go to work at 10 p.m., and they know how to work without any distractions. They've done it for generations. It's all they know. These are going to be the most productive workers in America. We'll invest in them to become steel workers. They will become the best steel workers in America. Lo and behold, it is the most productive steel factory in the United States today. The reason why it's competitive with China and Japan is because it's so productive. And this really got me thinking, what is the sociological base for the right? Farmers, agricultural workers, the military. Historically, obviously, there have been revolutionary armies. In this country, I mean, the military and business people. These are all people that will work mega hard, will take mega risks, will risk their physical health for a greater good. And you think, wow, if you're thinking politically, that's a really good social base to draw on. Now, historically, of course, the left has had very similar groups. Industrial workers work very hard, have to take risks. You're in a large workplace, a sense of camaraderie and so on. But clearly in post-industrial societies, that changes. And actually a larger and larger part of our social base are the professional managerial class, or you might say, graduates without a future. Now, there's been a change in the last 10 to 15 years where lots of those people materially are getting poorer, but I think the culture is actually broadly the same about the professional managerial class. And Dan Evans, who is superb, I think you and him have to have a conversation about this stuff.
I mean, I cite him a lot in this book. I do. I don't fully agree with him, and I think there are things missing. But I think that his contribution to how we think about class and how we think about identity and how we think about the living, breathing, textured way in which we live class, I think he's brilliant for that. I think he's really, really good for that.
Yeah, that formulation he has of the petit bourgeois, and the professional managerial class being at the core of these two very different political projects, I think is spot on. One thing he says, which really sticks with me, and it's talking about, identity politics, and that's that quote from page, again, let me get it right, page 46. Let's get this back here. The yakety yak of arts and humanities seminars. And then this particular part here, the overeducated and insecure probably aren't the best people for creating a healthy political culture. And that really got me thinking of what he talks about with the professional managerial class. And actually, how they view politics is in part, yes, it's about their job, but it's also about how they raise as children. Because their parents are managers. They see their parents their entire lives telling people what to do, bossing people around. The parents in their workplaces are used to telling people what to do. They're line managing people. When they go back to home, that's also how they treat the family, right? And I was like, when Dan wrote about that, I thought, wow, that is so true. There's so many people I've met, and it's not to criticize them. That's their background. My dad's a taxi driver, used to work in a kebab shop. My mum was a cleaning lady. They weren't angels. They had very bad things about them, like we all do. But they couldn't police me in the same way that a very confident, competent middle-class manager would with their kids. It's just a very different thing. I mean, where does that fit in all this?
I mean, when I say overeducated and insecure, again, part of that is an age thing. I mean, come on. Like, when I was in my 20s, I was screamingly insecure. Absolutely just riddled with insecurity, terrified that nobody would find me if I didn't work overtime to make myself visible in some way. And
what do you mean nobody would find you?
If I'm talking about love, I'm talking about regard, I'm talking about validation, I'm talking about social connection.
Do you mean professionally, though, as well? Where does that fit in all this?
So I think professionally maybe didn't... I think for lots of people, that material economic insecurity is obviously a massive deal. For me, it wasn't so much because I probably didn't think about it enough. But that's just me. The thing I'm talking about is the insecurity of being in your 20s and being like, how... I'm just going to be like lost in this flood of humanity if there's not anything to give me a leg up, boost upwards. And if I was called upon then, when I was 21, to be like, why don't you describe how a political culture should work, it would probably be on quite socially maladapted principles. That's also one of the things that I'm trying to get at. So it's insecure. Obviously, there's economic insecurity, and the impact of economic security is a theme that runs the whole way through this book. But also there's like an emotional, psychological insecurity as well, which I think you need to examine. Again, if you want to be an effective political actor, what is it Sun Tzu says? Know yourself and know your enemy, and you need not fear the outcome of 1,000 battles. In my early 20s, I did not know myself at all.
There's also the Goethe quote, isn't there?
What's
Look
that?
at us all literate. Know myself, heaven forbid. So we talked about identity politics and its impact in society and whatnot. Let's talk about its application with regards to social movements, particularly over the last 15 years. You write that the success of a cause isn't measured by policy wins, it's measured by airtime. What does that mean?
So I think, again, it's when you look at the movements which have been really prominent in the last 10 years, you'd have to say BLM, I think you'd have to say Me Too. I don't think that there have been many at the level of legislation, policy wins that you can go, yes, one. But they've been hugely impactful in terms of shaping culture, in terms of shaping cultural production. I mean, when you think about what television looks like now, what films look like now, completely different. And I think that it's become a way in which political organizations and NGOs measure their impact. They measure it by how much media coverage they're getting, by likes, by shares, by spots on panel shows. And one of the things that I make clear, because again, like what I hope this is a fundamentally materialist analysis of society, that is a reflection of the enormous growth of the media and social media sectors. Right? Of course, attention becomes hugely important because it's a more important commodity than ever. But I think that those metrics have become a way in which people understand political success, even if at the legislative level or at the material level, things aren't changing all that much. And I think that, we've internalized that. So when one cause is in the spotlight, there's always a chorus of people going, what about this one? 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 And sure, again, like one of the chapters in the book is about how things become news stories. That is an expression of power and vested interests. But sometimes people do it out of a sense of like, what about me? And there's something kind of infantilized about that. So, let's say it's a news story about transphobia, right? Imagine if every time I saw that, I was like, what about me? What about Muslims? Hello? What about me? But there are people who do that. There are people who look at the world through that lens. When something is not about them, they go, that's a problem. But also when things are about them, that's also a problem too.
Have those people always existed, or is it kind of like historically contingent on the kinds of technologies we use, social media, some of the ideas we've talked about with regards to identity politics? Or is it that those people have always existed at scale, but now they just have the capacity to reach an audience?
No, I think we've been shaped by technology. I think we've been shaped by the fact that we are constantly carrying a mirror to ourselves in our pocket all the time. Everything being a mirror to the self. I mean, there's a reason why the Greek myth of Narcissus is staring at yourself for too long is going to kill you. We've created all of these mirrors to ourselves. So I think that that's changed how we look at the world. We expect to see ourselves in everything, right? So if something is a picture rather than a mirror, we go, oh, that's a problem, rather than going, what does that picture lead me to?
Do you think that's everyone or young people? I mean, this is a really important question, actually. We're going to talk about the right and, the identity politics on the other side of the aisle. So is that narcissism, is it like 18 to 40-year-olds are like that, or is it right across the sort of demographic spectrum?
I think it's increasingly across the demographic spectrum. So, again, the most important part of the book, or the bit which takes up the most space, is not about the identity politics of the left, it's the identity politics of the right and how they wield and weaponize grievance amongst people who you would say are white, working class or lower middle class. And what they've done is whenever, there is an image of minority identities, whether it's ethnic or gender or whatever, what they specialize in is going, you're not in this picture. And it's the kind of thing which, take someone like Lawrence Fox, does it all the time, right? He'll, screen grab an advert or a TV show. And effectively what you're saying is, where are the white people, right? It's a similar thing of going, you're not in this picture. So I think that it's a tactic and a technique which begins in, highly online, marginal political spaces of the left, but it's become a tactic of the right. And
Tumblr id poll conquered the world. Is that what you're saying?
I think it kind of has. I mean, again, like the how the I took over identity politics chapter, where I end is not just by being like, and these things are really annoying on the left. They are, but that's not all I'm talking about. I have a look at how Israel's advocates have weaponized identity politics within the context of the genocide, and also sort of more broadly. They come back to these things of like, well, a minority group gets to define its own oppression. So you've got an organisation like the ADL who goes, watermelon pins and kefirs, that's anti-Semitism. Elon Musk doing what looks strikingly like a fascist salute. Oh no, that's fine.
Do you think it was a fascist salute?
Yeah. I mean, I've got eyes.
I do as well. I'm just, it's obviously contested. I think he did it to trigger the libs, but I think it's still a fascist salute.
I think it's sort of both, right? It's like, and this is something which I wish I had the ability to give an answer to, but I don't. All I have is the ability to frame the question. What the writer specialists are doing is doing things like whether it's a fascist salute or going, pedal to the metal on transphobia, both because they believe in it or they're happy to strengthen that as a political force, but also because it distracts the left. And it pulls us away from being able to talk about the experience of majorities, and we're talking about the experiences of minorities. And there's that incredible graph, which I think was from the Financial Times again, where it mapped perceptions of the Democrats over time. Line goes up, they stand up for the marginalised. Line goes down, they stand up for the working class. The fact that marginalised and working class are seen as mutually hostile, opposing groups.
Crazy. Incredible.
Like the right are winning. That is a victory for them. That is such a victory.
Mm. And to be clear, that is the heart of the book. And this transition really over a period of a decade from much of the media talking about chavs and a multiracial working class, in particularly, critical ways, to all of a sudden really valorizing and validating the white working class, and actually saying we need to be your liberators. We'll talk about that more in a moment.
Oh yeah, because it makes me so mad. It makes me so mad. The fact that, so Aaron, I hate journalists. I love journalism and the practice of journalism. I fucking hate journalists.
You're like Jack Nicholson in Is It As Good As It Gets?
I've not seen that film.
Have you not seen it?
No.
He goes, I love humanity, but I hate humans. It's like the inversion of like Robespierre. He loves humanity. He loves it, or you're meant to love humans. Anyway,
I just like. Obviously, I don't hate all journalists, but there's too many people who behave in exactly this way. The exact same individuals who in the early 2000s were referring to chavs as things like, and I'm quoting directly, lard, gutted, slappers, and dismal ineducables. Then, early 2010s are like, what about the forgotten white working class? And I was like, you were demonizing these people just a couple of years ago. The exact same individual journalists who are going, I hate these people. Wouldn't it be great if they were euthanized? Then turn around, they go, oh, the left have forgotten the white working class and it's all the fault of anti-racism. Now, what they're able to tap into, which is true, is that the liberal left, the centre left, did not give a flying fuck about these people and actually thought of them as sort of an electoral encumbrance, right? That's true. But the bit they're ignoring is that they were gleeful participants in that moral panic as well. And that's the thing that pisses me off. And I know maybe I shouldn't be annoyed because I should be like, well, obviously media works like this. It's in the service of elite interests. But to have that little integrity, I find that astonishing. I find that astonishing. I don't know how you sleep at night. I don't know how you look at yourself in the mirror. I don't know how you live with yourself as a man when that's your journalistic career. I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about the people I name.
Well, I do think, I do. And look, this is an open question. We live in a post-ideological, secular society. And I'm not saying that has upsides. We have, fewer religious zealots than 400 or 500 years ago. Great. It has downsides. Lots of people literally have no moral compass. Like lots of people. Most people still do, but lots of people do not have a moral compass. They don't have a sense of shame. Like lots of people, and that's infused our politics.
And it's fine to change your mind. It's fine to go, you know what? I was one of the people that got this wrong. And now what I realise is that, this cohort of people were actually being screwed over. it's beautiful to change your mind, and it's really hard to do that publicly. It's really hard to do it, and I really respect people who do that. The fact that you're going from one song to the other without skipping a beat, ugh.
Well, I think the hallmark, you don't have a mind unless you can change it, right? I mean, I'm not going to take you seriously unless you're capable of changing your mind. But I do, and it's something I've written in the notes here when I was reading this. I just think post-ideological societies are very stupid. And I think the political elites of post-ideological societies are very stupid. There's a reason why, Europe is screwed, actually. Anyway, this is from Peter Mandelson, and it's very similar to the lines you were just giving from James Dellingpole a moment ago. Now, Peter Mandelson would say that the woke left has given up on the white working class. Listen to this. We are the long-term benefit-claiming working-class poor living through another period of cultural contempt. We are losers, no-hopers, low-life scroungers. Our culture is yob culture. You can literally imagine him saying all of this. The importance of welfare provisions to our lives has been denigrated and turned against us. We are welfare dependent, and our problems won't be solved by giving us higher benefits. We are perverse in our failure to succeed, dragging our feet over social change, wanting the old jobs back, still having babies instead of careers, stuck in outdated class and gender molds. First of all, you're right to say that I can't imagine him saying that now, for a couple of reasons, for the sort of gendered language of it, denigrating having children. Also, this gets me really angry, Ash. You have people like him talk about Labour will stand up for hard-working families. I don't think he has any children. I might be wrong. At which point people say, well, he's a gay man. Gay people can have children. He's denigrating people that want to have kids. Society doesn't exist without kids. It's the hardest job out there, by the way, is to be a single mum. It is the hardest job in the world. I'm not saying that for brownie points or to be woke. As somebody who's got a 14-month-old child, I cannot imagine doing it by myself. It's literally inconceivable to me. I would rather, honest to God, I'd rather like crawl through a tunnel 60 hours a week by myself. But that contempt that he has for ordinary people, and now within the space of 10 to 15 years, to invert that and say my political opponents think all of this stuff and that's why they're awful people and should be nowhere near power. I mean, how commonplace, you've talked about journalists, how commonplace do you think that kind of mindset is amongst the political class of Westminster?
It was very commonplace. So Andrew Fisher tells a story about when he was a SPAD and he was talking to a new Labour minister who said, well, these people, i.e. the working class, they've got to learn that there's more to life than the journey from the bed to the sofa every day. Like, that's how benefits claimants were viewed by, this would have been in the 2000s when this was said to Andrew Fisher. And Andrew Fisher tells this as a story about how he came to, become a policy advisor for Jeremy Corbyn and why he thought that the left-wing takeover of the Labour Party was so important. And he talks about that as a sort of profoundly impactful and politicising moment. And it was, it was for me as well. I mean, I was 5 years old in 1997, and I remember how my mum reacted to Labour victory, the first one since 1979. And at that point, she was a single mum. She had 2 kids under the age of 11, and it was hard. it was just hard, and I don't know how she did it. And one of the first things that this new Labour government did was remove some of the welfare support for single mums. One of the first things. And that is after John Major's done his back to basics thing. Single mums are presented as, responsible for all manner of ills in society. And then you had a new Labour government come in, rather than being like, that's bullshit. We've come in on a landslide. That's bullshit. The country is with us. It was continuing it. And I think between that and the Iraq War, she experienced that as a profound betrayal, like a really, really profound betrayal. But yeah, as for that demonization of the multi-ethnic working class single mums, that was the dominant common sense of the early 2000s. And if you were one of the people that said, you are just demonizing, criminalizing people for being brown, and, the Vicky Pollard thing, where... Little Britain. I mean, oh God, some of our audience are going to be in their 20s, and miraculously, you'll have never watched this terrible show. But Vicky Pollard was played by Matt Lucas. I believe he went to a private school. I really hate the fact that all these people went to private school as well.
But he went to a good one, right? As well. When I say good one, like there's schools that you pay fees for, and there's like 50 grand a year ones. I think he went to I think they both went to like top ones. Anyway, I think they both boarded is the point, right? I could be wrong. I could be wrong.
And then this program, which is like, you know, like how stupid are poor people? And Vicky Pollard, one of the recurring gags was that she'd had this pram, which was like multiple prams at once, and she'd push it like this. And the children were all of different races. So what's more disgusting than a poor white woman? Oh, it's a poor white woman who has sex with men of colour, obviously. Like, that was a big part of the Chavs moral panic. And I think that Owen Jones's work in the book Chavs was really important. I think that maybe he could have paid a bit more attention to the racial dynamics of it, because part of why Chavs were so demonised wasn't just because they were benefits claimants. It wasn't just because they were seen as dismal ineducables. It was because they were seen as not white enough and sort of rolling around in the muck with ethnic minorities. What happens after the riots of 2011, which were catalysed by the police shooting of Mark Duggan, is that you see a rapid decline in the number of people talking about chavs, and you see an increase of people talking about the white working class. And what's so interesting about the 2011 riots, and again, I remember we were friends at this time and we were kind of experiencing this thing together and looking at it together, is that it wasn't just London and it wasn't just black and brown people. It was catalysed by the police shooting of a black man, but it wasn't just black people, brown people who were angry. You had white people out on the streets who would have been regarded as chavs by the, you know, Delingpoles and Mandelsons of the world, who were saying, we're doing this to get our tax money back, because they were angry at the bailout of the banks and that the government response had been to impose austerity. So that was a moment of cross-identification where you've got something which has got its origins in racialized police violence, but it's able to connect with and ignite the anger of people who are working class and white about their economic conditions.
I mean, I was in Tottenham the night it kicked off. I mean, you talk about this being in the book because, you know, you went there, your mum is in that part of the world. I cycled up there like an idiot to see what was going on, right? And I remember being in the middle of it was a riot with my bike, my quite nice fixie, and I'm thinking, I probably should lock this up.
With the drop handlebars.
Yeah, I probably should lock this up, actually. The Kieran handlebar. It's probably not wise. Somebody's going to use this to lob at the cops. I will never forget an image of there was a young white boy, maybe early 20s, late teens. And you know, you get those like white jumpsuits, very like thin cotton jumpsuits the police give you if they take your clothes off of you.
Yeah.
They take your phone or whatever, and they say, we're going to use this as part of the, you know, the potential prosecution. It might be used to identify you, etc. So you're given this like kind of suit, right? And it's almost like it's also a source of shame. Now I know this because I'm actually worn one of those. And it was interesting that young man came out wearing this white suit and he was throwing stuff at the cops. He had it, and it was for him almost a sign of, fuck you, I'm still here. And that was one of the most political evenings of my life. Yeah. I in no way felt unsafe, right? And people will not believe this. Looking back, I was like, Aaron, are you mad? I mean, I was a 26-year-old man, so you think you're invincible anyway, but I didn't feel unsafe. I didn't think I was in danger. And maybe I was wrong, but there was absolutely zero anger or violence to any person. I'm not talking about shops or buildings, because buildings were being smashed up. Not as many as were being stated, but some people were smashing up shops to get things to throw at the cops. I saw that. I saw booze being taken and some people trying to, you know, turn it into Molotovs and whatnot. But in terms of violence against persons, it's all directed at the police. All of that antipathy. Now, I'm not suggesting you agree or disagree or whatever, but it was just a remarkably political moment. It was very clear to me immediately what was happening. And then to see the media coverage, this is apolitical, it's just, you know, it's chaos driven by nothing more than trying to steal consumer items. I thought, you have no idea. This is a psyop. I mean, I think that, one of the things that happened, literally, I was just about to put the final full stop on the manuscript, send it off to my editor, like fuck off down the pub and celebrate that this thing which had been hanging over my head for ages was done, was that the riots of 2024 kicked off, which were
aimed at hotels which were housing asylum seekers and involved racist violence being meted out to people who were perceived as immigrants or people of colour. And I messaged my editor and I was just like, I can't send in the manuscript right now. Like I have to think about this and write about this. And even if it's just partial, and even if I don't fully understand everything that's happened, I need to write something about it. And what I really believe is that when rioters are telling you why they're rioting, take them seriously. It doesn't mean that their perception of reality is always true, and it doesn't mean that they're morally justified in what they're doing, but believe them when they tell you what it's about. So the fact that during the 2011 riots, people were saying police violence, austerity, the bailout, take that seriously. The fact that in the 2024 riots, you had people talking about immigration, asylum seekers, lack of opportunity, managed decline of their communities, and that they were also telling you why they were doing things when it came to, the racist graffiti that was over everything. Believe them. Believe them when they say that's what it's about. That doesn't mean it's morally justified, but it means you have to really look seriously at these issues and how they become so powerfully felt by people that they're willing to risk their own freedom to act on it in some way, to act on that anger.
Do you think the 2024 riots are kind of like a mirror image of the 2011 ones then? It seems to me that's what you're saying. I mean, the stuff that we saw, for instance, in bits of the Northeast, Hartlepool, Middlesbrough, Sunderland, it was shocking. And obviously it was horrific. People were attacking brown or black people. I only saw instances of brown people purely on the basis of their skin colour.
In Manchester, Piccadilly, there was a black man attacked by a mob of racists in Piccadilly Gardens, I think. I think that it's almost like a photo negative. If the 2011 riots were driven by a multi-ethnic working class, this is obviously almost entirely white. If the 2011 riots were directed at the police, this was directed at people who are, equally as vulnerable as the rioters themselves, if not more so, like asylum seekers. And if the 2011 riots were sparked by something which the community knew and felt to be true, and that wasn't represented in the mainstream media, which is that black men are unfairly and violently treated by the police, the 2024 riots reflected something which is all over mainstream media, which is the asylum-seeking menace. So this is what I mean by a sort of photo negative. I don't think that they're morally comparable. I think it's very different to try and kill asylum seekers by burning them alive in their hotel versus targeting police officers. That doesn't mean I think that the violence against persons during the 2011 riots was justified. I just think that there's a moral difference between rioting because a man was shot dead by police versus rioting because you want to burn down an asylum hotel.
Well, so if I put on a hat and I think of the people that, I try and talk to when I'm on GB News, mm-hmm. and if they're watching now, and I hope they're watching, I want them to be watching, I want as many people to watch our videos as possible and to buy your book as possible, obviously.
I've got a cat to feed.
They would be saying, Ash, those people rioting because 3 young girls were killed in Southport. That's what they would be saying. Yes, some people did things which were outrageous. Arson is a serious criminal offence, obviously. Incitement to riot, these are serious offences. But not everybody on those riots or protests, and I think often the line between a protest and a riot is
blurry.
Very blurry, let's be honest, and that works on all sides of the political compass. That's really unfair. And actually, Mark Duggan was murdered by the police. He was unlawfully killed. That's not an opinion, that's a fact. I think he was murdered, but let's use unlawfully killed. That's more analytical. Mark Duggan was unlawfully killed by the police. They are then completely insensitive in the immediate aftermath of that. There's false information that's put out into the public domain by police, public relations people, such as he had a gun, he shot a police officer, it was in their radio. Complete lie. That bullet was from another police gun. But then that mirror image is there with the Southport killing of these 3. I mean, I can't imagine a more horrific crime, frankly, than stabbing to death 3 young girls. And yes, some people are wrong and some people took it too far, but actually those protests aren't as illegitimate as you're saying.
So I think
I don't agree with that point of view, but that's what they would say to you.
I think there's a few things. So this is where I think that there are some commonalities between the riots, which is when you look at who was, charged and sentenced for the 2024 riots, what you see are people who have been completely let down by multiple services and public institutions. Many of them care experienced. Many of them have been incarcerated multiple times before. You also had people who Dan Evans would describe as petty bourgeoisie, so your plumbers and your kitchen fitters, so on and so forth. But I think that sense of the people who are participating are from places with an endemic lack of opportunity and a lack of a sense of optimism, right? You walk down your high street and it looks like complete shit. There's a sort of mirror there to the 2011 riots, and I think that the principle that happy, confident people, as in confident about the future, they don't smash up things, right? They've got too much to lose. That's where I think that there are some things in common. But when it comes to the Southport killings, which, just today, because the sentencing of Axel Rudakabana was today, and the description of the footage played in court is, harrowing isn't a big enough word. Do you know what I mean? Like, I don't have kids.
No, there aren't words for murdering three little girls.
But the bit of footage where the description stuck with me is that from the CCTV outside the dance class, apparently a little girl tried to escape and he grabbed her and pulled her back in. And there's something about the horror of that which I can't get my head around. Those murders only had something to do with immigration if you think that the child of immigrants isn't really British.
Also, one of the children that was murdered was, I believe, a child of immigrants.
So do you see what I mean? It's like it was simply because Axel Rudakabana was the child of Rwandan migrants, and I think because
a critic again would say, well, no, it's asylum seekers actually. So it's about what kinds of immigration, from where, and what kinds of people. And let's be really kind to that point of view. They would say, look, Ash, I have no problem with these people, but realistically, there is a very high probability when you accept tens or hundreds of thousands of people from brutalized societies, traumatized societies, riven with ethnic conflict and civil war. It is more probable that people like this will do what happened. And that's quite a again, I'm not saying I agree, but that's quite a strong argument.
And look, maybe the experiences of his family during the Rwandan genocide contributed to his fascination with violence. I don't know. I can't say that for certain. What I can say for certain is that in terms of what's been made public so far, more things might come out, but in terms of what's been made public so far about the sort of materials that he was accessing, the behavioural problems that he exhibited since he was a teenager, the fact that he had wanted to go carry out a violent attack at his former school, I think you've got a lot in common with an American school shooter. You sound an awful lot like an American school shooter to me. I don't know whether his parents' background is an adequate explanation for what it is that he did, especially when you can say there is this kind of violence carried out in the United States by people who share many of the same qualities, like psychological qualities.
But we're not the US, right? There's more of this stuff happening quantitatively. There's more of this stuff happening now in Europe than before. Like I remember the James Bulger killing with the two kids, and that's a really important point, right? This is not new. There have been wrong-uns since forever, and that was two young white boys, torturing and killing a young white child. But the argument would be, and I'm not entirely unsympathetic to this, that we have a style of mental health care in this country, which is care in the community, right? We don't really treat people who are mentally unwell in the same way we did 50, 60, 70 years ago, for very good reasons. And at the same time, you have people who've seen all kinds of horrific stuff coming here to an extent that wasn't the case previously. Now, this is where I find an interesting dissonance within the left. Because the left will say climate change will create this century hundreds of millions of refugees. Hundreds, probably will, right? They might not all be necessarily like directly climate related, but climate leads to conflict, leads to immigration and displacement. Climate change will create hundreds of millions of refugees. Our economic system will continue to generate very little wealth for people at the bottom, or even, in fact, in the middle. We live in a moment of crisis, but then you establish all of that and you say, well, okay, one of the negative after effects of that is that people fleeing these horrible conditions will come to the global north. We can't do anything about that. Now, the right-wing argument is quite clearly, don't let them in. Now, I'm not suggesting you let them in or don't let them in, but it seems obvious to me that this is just such an incredible weak spot for the left. And actually, it's quite, let me finish because then you can come back and say I'm wrong. And then it's coded as the left, and I don't think this, obviously I don't think this, the left doesn't care about 3 young girls being stabbed to death. Or in Bavaria yesterday, a 2-year-old was stabbed at a kindergarten trip. The 2-year-old, by the way, was Moroccan. The assailant was Afghan, right? This is really important. This is not about white or brown or black. It's about somebody who was, presumed to be safe by their family in Germany, wasn't safe. And people can say, well, the left doesn't care about that stuff. Where's the evidence that the left cares about that stuff? And I obviously don't think that's true, but I know that's not true. I mean, I know lots of left-wing people. I've met lots of left-wing people in my life. But it does feel like a massive Achilles heel.
So I think there's a lot to respond to.
And it's obviously made in bad faith by political opponents, but it does feel like an exposed point of,
There's a lot to respond to here, so I'm going to do my best to answer. The first thing is that when it comes to Axel Rudikabana, the fact that he isn't white, his parents were from Rwanda, for the right wing is a self-evident explanation. They go, well, there you go.
Yeah.
Causal link. And the thing I'm saying is, well, I don't know that there is. I've got no idea what his parents were like. I have no idea what their parents experienced in Rwanda. I've got no idea what knowledge he was raised with about that. None whatsoever. It is purely speculation to say that one has contributed to the other. What we do know, fascination with violence, accessing violent materials, a history of bringing in a knife to school, and that his father had tried to stop him from going to his former school with a knife, right? These are things that we all know. There is nothing to me other than the fact of his race, which says, view this through a racial lens. That's what I'm saying, is that I don't know whether his parents' background explains this or not. There isn't any evidence being shown to me that it does.
I'm not saying for one moment, look at it through a racial lens. I'm saying look at it through a lens...
But the right absolutely is.
But look at it through a lens of highly traumatized people going through horrific things. Look, if I had been a child and grown up during the Syrian civil war or in Afghanistan, I would be a very different person. Like, it's just an obvious point, isn't it?
Another court case which has gone through recently, and actually the perpetrator of this grew up not that far from me in Enfield. Kyle Clifford, I think it was, who murdered his former girlfriend's sister, girlfriend's mum at the home in Bushy with a crossbow. Horrendous. Obviously, the murder of children has a special and particular kind of horror for us. But here we've got this guy who appears to be white British, who perpetrated this appalling act of violence. Also, his elder brother is in prison for murder and attempted GBH, I think. At no point in any of the coverage are we told to look for signs in his parents' background or story for why he did what he did. None whatsoever, right? I've got no... His parents might be traumatized by something. I don't know. No one has said, this is how you look at that story. We look at the story through the lens of a man who, friends of the victim allege was, coercive and controlling. When it comes to Axel Rudikabana, the only frame of understanding that the right will accept, and I talk about this in the book with regards to other kinds of social issues, the only frame of understanding they will accept is, well, this had to have something to do with immigration and race. Why? Well, his parents are Rwandan immigrants. If I said, when talking about the Kyle Clifford story, it's got to be something to do with his parents' experience, they'd go, well, why'd you say that? You don't know anything about them. And that's true. But I know as much about Carl Clifford's parents as I know about Axel Rita Cabana's. And so this is my point about the way stories are framed and how we're encouraged to think about them, which is the right want to make race, immigration status, ethnic identity, religion causal whenever it's a minority ethnic person or minority religious person, in particular if they're Muslim. When it comes to other forms of horrific violent crime perpetrated by people who are white British, you would be laughed out of town for saying, well, there's a sort of prima facie case for looking at it through a racial lens because, look, they're white. Got to have something to do with it. And this is the point.
Do you think that's a little bit intellectually dishonest, though?
No.
Like Salman Abedi is Libyan, right? The Manchester bomber was Libyan. And I just think it's kind of, if you say, well, he's Libyan, but this other person who killed like three people.
He went to Libya.
Quite. I mean, that's the thing I would say.
He went to Libya. So the fact of him being Libyan.
Theresa May was saying, go fight in Libya against Gaddafi. MI6 will train you. I mean, that's the thing, right?
But that's evidence, right? That's you've said, here's why it's important, because he went to Libya.
Yes. Right? That would be my response if I was talking on GB News or whatever. Yeah.
And that's not speculative. The thing I'm saying about Axel Rid Cabana is that is, right? Maybe something will come out and I'll go, yeah, you know what? This is good enough evidence to look at it through this lens. But before we knew anything about him, you had right-wingers, including Matt Goodwin, saying that the fact that his parents were Rwandan immigrants is all you need to know.
Yeah.
And
is that's racist?
I think that is racist.
I mean, prior to that, they were even saying he was an Islamic extremist, which again, he may be. There's literally zero evidence.
Well, they were saying that he was an asylum seeker called Ali al-Shakti or something. I mean, when I'm saying what I'm talking about are far right accounts online. The person who appears
quite big influencers, actually, right?
Well, the person who appears to have been the first person to have said that was arrested shortly after the riots finished. But again, it's like race is the only way you're allowed to look at this. You can't look at it through any other lens. And the only reason why you're encouraged to look at it through the lens of race is because of his race, right? It's so tautological. And the minute you try to apply it to anything else, you'd be laughed out of town. I mean, similarly, and this is something which I talk about in the book, is that there are so many other ways in which, with certain things, only one answer is allowed, right? Even though the truth might be more complicated and nuanced and various than this one answer, only one answer will be accepted. And I'll tell you the sort of classic example of this, which I go into in some detail. You know that whole can a woman have a penis thing?
Yes.
Right? Fucking hell. Can a woman have a penis? Overnight, it became the preferred line of questioning for basically every political interviewer on British television. And I wondered, where had this come from? Like, where had this line of questioning emerged from? Through my research, the best answer that I can find is that the slogan, "Women don't have penises," was a sticker designed by an anti-trans activist by the name of Venice Allen. She'd probably describe herself as gender critical, I would say anti-trans. So on Twitter, if I posted about anything, right, it could be about football, right, it could be Spurs in the transfer window, there'd be, a trans hostile feminist being like, well, Ash, you don't even know whether a woman has a penis, and that question, only one answer is acceptable. Because if you go, well, okay, actually, most women are born without penises, but you've got trans women, and they might be at a place in their transition before they have bottom surgery. Or you might have women with intersex conditions where they've got, sexual or reproductive organs which are, characterized as male.
Which is like 1.5% of the population.
Yeah, but
a significant number of people.
Yeah, so there's a study which suggests that it could be as high as 1.5%. It's still really hard to know how many people with intersex conditions there are.
But there's this gender essentialism. It's tiny number. Well, actually, there is a lot of ambiguity for,
Yeah, I mean,
in this country, like 1 million plus people potentially.
There's a sizable number of people out there with intersex conditions, and I think that if you met a woman with an intersex conditions, which meant that she had, a uterus and a vagina, but had, undescended testes or something, we wouldn't be like, well, you're not a real woman. You've got testes, right? That would be cruel. We would go, well, you live as a woman and everyone treats you as a woman, so that's probably more important. So that's the answer which reality tells you, which is most women are born without penises, but, trans women exist and women with intersex conditions exist. That's not acceptable, because if you say that to Kay Burley or Nick Ferrari, they're like, puh! Right? It's so dismissive. The only acceptable answer is no. And this is the thing about the way in which media and the ideological motivations of people within the media, it places a thumb on the scale and tries to make reality this reductive and hostile and polarized thing. The real answer, which is gender is complicated, is unacceptable. Unacceptable. The only one that will suffice is one which essentially denies the existence of transgender women and women with intersex conditions.
Why is the media so trivial? And has it got worse? When did it get worse? Like, a lot of this stuff is just inconceivable. 20 years ago, there would actually be a much more thoughtful level of debate. Now, and that's not to say the media was perfect, because, much of the media backed an illegal war in Iraq based on a pack of lies. But it does feel like that the media now actively tries to feed into political polarization by intention, by design, in a way that it wasn't doing, or at least not to the same extent. I mean, you'd have had the Murdoch media for a very long time, but it didn't feel the same 20 years ago. It was okay in the media to say 20 years ago, you know what, I don't really have a view on this, or, I'm not so sure, or it's a complicated argument, whereas now that's simply impermissible.
I think it's crazy that a sitting prime minister has to give an opinion on what he thinks about the Oscars slap that happened a couple of years ago. Like, I think that's just insane. I think that any serious politician should be like, I do not care about this ridiculous thing that happened. But, like, they have to sort of conjure up a, very serious opinion because, that's what media demands of them. And also because their status as politicians is so degraded by 40 years of neoliberalism and the state being less and less in control of, the really fundamental aspects of society, that, many politicians are just glorified pundits. Like, that's what a lot of their job is. How did it become so trivial? I think that there are multiple factors that need to be considered. One is the fact that news has become more expensive just as the revenues are falling. So original news gathering, expensive, opinion pieces based on whatever shit is online, cheap. It means that your journalist can just stay tied to the laptop rather than being out there in the world and finding things.
And that precedes social media?
I think that it has been made more acute by social media, right, because you've got an essentially free information competitor. So that devalues the advertising revenue that news can get, and news gathering's more expensive. You've also got social media, what bangs on social media, what flies, what goes, something which is zeitgeisty and trivial, right? The fact that how algorithms work and what will do well and what won't do well, it's a black box. We don't know what it is. There seems to be evidence that things which stimulate outrage and, when I talk about arousal, I'm not talking about like horniness, I'm talking about like aroused reactive emotions. That seems to be what does well. So these sort of like polarizing micro events, great, both cheap to produce, do well on social media. The emergence of the 24-hour news cycle, super important because there's only so much news to be got. So that means that the commentary ring, around the donut hole of news gets bigger because you've got more space to fill. And, something really interesting happens in 1968, I believe it is. You had these sort of debates which were between Gore Vidal and William F. Buckley. So Gore Vidal, obviously a sort of iconoclastic left-wing writer, very, very intelligent man. William F. Buckley, the editor of the National Review, very right-wing, but also very intelligent guy. And they had this huge disagreement about whether or not it was right for police to attack anti-Vietnam War protesters outside the DNC in Chicago. And they both lob insults at each other. And it was both seen as sort of a low point for enlightened reasoned debate, but also the ratings killed. Like it did so well. And I think that was a moment, and this is covered by an incredible documentary called Best of Enemies, and a play was based on it as well, where I think television producers knew that heat does better than light. It can hold people's attention better. So I think all these things have contributed to the rise of just trivial shit taking over the media. And for me, one of the really important things about this sort of dominance of micro events is that there are these little inaccuracies very often in each one. So Piers Morgan, who I interview in the book, who's very generous with his time, he wrote this book called Wake Up, and you know the beginning
didn't do very well. Didn't do very well, by the way.
I don't think it did very well.
You got a major pay deal with it, yeah.
But in this book, he's like, oh, the moment I realised the world went mad was when Justin Trudeau said that the word mankind should be outlawed and it should be people kind instead. And then I went back and I had a look at the original news story, and I was like, he didn't say anything of the kind. He, perhaps jokingly, when someone said mankind, said, we don't use that word, we say people kind. Now, you might say that's stupid or that's risible.
It's kind of half joking,
right? But he didn't call for it to be outlawed. Like, outlawing has got a specific meaning. That didn't happen. Similarly, many of the stories that you'll read about NHS trust bans calling women mothers, you then look into the story and you go, oh, this was from a specific piece of guidance about how to treat trans and non-binary patients. So not, most cisgender women who are coming into the maternity unit. It's specifically for trans and non-binary people. But all of these little inaccuracies build up. And what you get is the sort of carnival hall of mirrors where the image in front of you is warped and distorted and blown up out of all recognition. And that's what I think is important about this mess of trivial media. It's not just that it's unimportant, it's that it makes big things look small, big things like inequality, climate change, the kind of oligarchic death grip on politics. Big things look small, small things look big.
Yeah. But this is also why lots of people, we started this conversation by talking about how many people are black-pilled. And I think that's partly an outgrowth of what you're talking about. So you very rarely get the good news stories. Last year, we potentially cured cystic fibrosis. We now have, it seems, quantum computing. There are a panoply of applications with regards to AI and finding all kinds of medicines we can't even really imagine. All kinds of amazing stories every day. Amazing stories. There are electric vehicles being built in China for $20,000.
I'm going to say China properly.
China.
There you go.
A lot of people are saying it. I do love the way he goes, Puerto Rico. It's amazing. Anyway, they're building EVs in China, which I sound like him. They're building EVs in China, which are $20,000.
They're building the EVs. They're eating the dogs. They're eating the cats. I can't do it as well as you, but
they're even eating the dogs in the EVs. Can you believe that? It's true. So remarkable things are happening, but like you say, because we have a media which takes the facile and makes it really big, and takes the really big and just basically ignores it, I do think that's a major reason why lots of people are black-pilled. And you find this whole thing of like birth strike, right? Young people don't want to have, by the way, if you don't want to have kids, you don't have kids. Do what you want. But they say, I don't want to have children because the future is so awful. Now, some bad things are going to happen in the future, but the past is also really awful. Statistically speaking, up until 150 years ago, we would both be dead by now. Right? That was in terms of median life expectancy from birth, it was like very low. So yes, the future isn't great, but the idea that, they aren't optimal conditions to have children, therefore I won't have them. Well, if you're using that logic, basically nobody would have had children between, say, like 1970 and like the dawn of time. So it's not a particularly powerful argument. I think that argument has particular resonance because of the media environment we operate in. Remarkable things happen all the time, but we ignore them and we blow up the really facile. There's a mirror image there, right? So we don't really report on climate change sufficiently. True. But also the good stuff as well is also ignored. You said about micro events, and I've seen some media scholars before talk about them as pseudo events, which is all the media covers basically, right? And we saw this up close with Corbyn, 2015 to 2019. Every single day, a new pseudo event.
He could sneeze.
Yeah.
And there would be 3 or 4 pages in the Daily Mail about it. I mean, it was crazy. It was honestly crazy. And I think that also shows you the way in which the lobby, i.e. the very elite political journalists who operate in Westminster, make the news coverage in the image of their own political beliefs. So again, in the book, I interview an anonymous lobby journalist who lifts the lid on what the culture of the lobby is. And one of the things he said to me was, the story was already written. Before it was printed, it was already written. And the story was this. Corbyn's a wrong 'un, his supporters are idiots. And that's what lobby journalists believed. And if you didn't believe that, you were frozen out and you wouldn't get the backup that you needed when it came to putting questions to the Prime Minister's spokesperson or whoever else. And you also couldn't be sure of career advancement because no one would want to promote you or hire you. So there is a herd mentality. There's a strong ideological bent to the lobby. And when you want to, ask yourself, well, how is it that misinformation can thrive? Part of it is because mainstream media has shown that it's completely unworthy of people's trust. And people can see it. People can see it. Whether you're left wing or right wing, I think you feel that way. And so I think there's a lot. I mean, look, I think that there are plenty of completely legit criticisms of this book. And one of them, I think, is that people are going to read it and go, you are just having a whinge. Where are the solutions? And my answer to that is yes, it is a very big whinge. But I really, really wanted to look at how dysfunctional so many of these organizations and institutions and cultures are, whether it's lobby journalism or punditry or the culture on the left or the way in which elections are contested and, the way in which the electoral system itself encourages certain voters being prioritized over others. I think it's for other people to look at the problems as I lay them out and come up with some solutions to it. Because I don't think journalists make very good strategists, or at least I don't.
Sort of Marx, I'm not here to write recipes for the cookshops of the future. Ash Sarkar,
I'm not here to write recipes for the cookshops of the now.
Yeah. So you talked about the lobby, and that's really interesting. I remember doing an event in 2019, spring of 2019, and it was at a literary festival, and you have all these middle class people, and they're saying that we're going to stop Brexit. It's not going to happen. We're going to overturn Brexit. And I was like, am I going mad? And maybe they're all right. All these people, highly qualified, loads of money. They can't all be stupid, right? Am I going mad? 400 seats voted to leave the EU. How do you stop that? Anyway, they were all saying that. And at the same time, they were saying, Jeremy Corbyn can't be Prime Minister, of course. And I said, but what conditions have to be met for you to accept your wrong? I remember having this conversation with the editor of quite a big magazine, economics magazine. And I said, I think if he was the Prime Minister, your phrase would then turn to, well, of course he can't stay the Prime Minister. So we're not talking here about predicting the future or facts, but your feelings in relation to a certain possibility. If that then becomes reality, your feelings won't change. It'll just become a new response. And your literal job is to try and make sense of the world. You are the worst person in the world to be editing a fucking magazine, because it's all about you and your feelings, not about any kind of wider curiosity with the world. And why the hell this guy isn't a particularly good politician. How on earth did he become the leader of the opposition? How did he get 40% in an election? They did not care. But
you know what they say? When you point a finger, there's 3 pointing back at you. So I'm going to look at the 3 pointing back at me. I got Brexit really wrong. And there are so many things that I got wrong during the Corbyn years, and I write about some of them. And I really wanted to look at why that was. Why did I get these things wrong? And, I could find a way to minimize it or dismiss it by being oh, well, you were young, you were dumb, you've learned. That's part of it. But another part of it is my biases and the way in which I'm a product of my environment. I'm a product of a London middle-class graduate social setting. And so when the Brexit impasse was, when nothing was moving and it felt like you had to pick a half of the country to piss off, I made the classic mistake of thinking my world was the world. And I thought that there were more people like me than there were. And I think that it's a really easy mistake for people to make.
Of course, we've all done it.
Right? Such an easy mistake for people to make. But I forgot that, in the words of, LBJ, the first rule of politics is learn how to count. I forgot that I had to do some counting. And it's because my social world felt so much more real to me than anyone else's social world. And the reason why it matters more for those of us on the left to break out of it is because we're at a disadvantage. We're at a disadvantage in terms of power, communications infrastructure, money, and also a lot of the time we make up numerical minorities. Right, we make up the smaller half of whatever it is we're talking about. So it is more incumbent on us to try and break out of that. And I think that maybe, 5 or 6 years ago, I found the idea of doing that so scary. So scared of being wrong. So scared of having my view of the world shaken up by new information. And getting to write a book and really spend time with what I'm thinking and being challenged in my own professional relationships and personal relationships, and also just getting that bit older. I'm like, okay, like not only is this not scary, you're going to have to suck it up, buttercup, and look at the ways in which you've been wrong and look at the ways in which your own social world has blinded you, because if you don't, you're going to lose.
I do distinctively remember May 2019, the local elections, the European elections. By the way, the Brexit Party came first in those elections, and people were saying it was proof that they could stop Brexit. I just thought, this is okay. We've gone into a new world here of alternate reality.
Forgetting how to count.
Yeah, they literally came first. Well, no, if you add them all up. Okay, right. Okay, we're not playing Jenga. And I was in a taxi. My wife's a counsellor. We were coming back from the count of the local elections, and we had the taxi driver, and the taxi driver was driving, and we're chatting away. 4 or 5 in the morning. He goes, "Oh, we get all sorts in here, all sorts." I'm going, "Oh, go on." No, it's full of funny people we've had in recently. What characters? Portsmouth is a working class city full of big characters. Go on, what characters? He goes, "Oh, we had somebody in here the other day. He thinks we're going to overturn Brexit." Can you imagine that? I'm thinking, fuck. Literally everybody I know thinks we're going to overturn Brexit. And there was another one campaigning ahead of those elections. I remember this really clearly. Ahead of the locals. Walking down the street, I'm canvassing for Labour, idiot, and handing out leaflets. And there's one guy in a wheelchair, rocker, leather jacket, and I'm thinking, oh, this is a Labour person, right? He's been given a bum deal by austerity. He's going to vote for Labour. No, fuck off, mate. Why is that? We vote to leave. I don't give a fuck about that. Leave me alone. Yeah, but what about austerity? Mate, fuck off. Who do you think you are? Don't tell me about that. We voted to leave. And that's just so at odds with the left-wing orthodoxy about how people vote, and the identity groups as well. He was part of something bigger. He really cared about the democratic vote of 2016 being respected. Whether or not he was in a wheelchair or had, been on the short end of, PIP and austerity, reforms, etc., was kind of immaterial to him. I'm sure he does care about it. But on that particular day, in that particular election, this was the most important issue to him. And the left is kind of blind on all that stuff, isn't it?
I think so. I think we want things to make sense according to our pre-existing ideas. And, rather than doing what Marx did, which is actually really examining the conditions of his society and then building into an analysis from that, we take the analysis and then work backwards to our view of society, which I don't think is right. I mean, there's very obvious reasons why that's wrong. I think that one of the things that I would like people to get from this is an understanding that two things are true at once. One is that part of the reason why the left is at a disadvantage is because issue salience and issue framing is being built out of our hands. That's true. But another reason why the left is at a disadvantage is that we take that feeling of being disempowered and cut off and we turn it into a virtue. We make powerlessness into a virtue. And this is why the book is called Minority Rule. It's about all the different ways in which minorities and majorities are constructed. The left takes minority status and goes, yes, moral authority lives here. And the reason why that's not going to work is because without speaking to the majority of people, without being part of the majority of people, we're going to lose. The right have worked out to play a very interesting game when it comes to how it frames minorities, which is it takes, the economic majority of people who are basically fucked over by our current economic model, and uses that sense of minority status being a virtue and says, oh, but you're being treated like a minority. You're the white working class. The important part of that is white, not working class. And the problem that we're facing is that, like, you know, that's creating a certain kind of political subject. The right is creating a certain kind of political subject. And on the other side, the left is suspicious and hostile to the idea of forming majority coalitions. And that is a bad place for the left to be in. Such a bad place.
Terrible. So, like you say, there's a victim status there for what is a majority population. And on the back of that, you build an anti-system politics, or you rhetorically build an anti-system politics, that is the project of the right now. And I think I don't think people realize how we're just at the beginning of this, right? Final question, Ash. Maybe we'll do a part 2. I don't know. When the paperback comes out? Maybe?
Yeah, the paperback comes out and I repudiate everything that I wrote in the first version.
Yeah. This is a personal question. You talk in the book about being a hate figure for some people. How does that shape you? How does that make you feel? How big of an impact has it had on you over the last couple of years?
It's I try not to feel it very much, and I try to manage it by not thinking too much that, like, you know, the other day someone like tweeted at me like, you're going to get what the Southport girls got. And when I really think about that, and I think about, like, oh, I could be stabbed to death, like, soon, I feel like an idiot for doing this job, and I feel like an idiot for making my mum worry. I feel like an idiot for making, like, my husband worry. And when it comes to the other kinds of abuse, it's very, especially the stuff to do with appearance, I don't know what I'm looking at in the mirror anymore a lot of the time. I just find it very hard to look at myself and have a realistic idea of what I'm seeing. My response to that, which my therapist is trying to get me to work on, but my response to that is to, like, freeze out and to try and not think about it and to be like, just keep going, don't feel it, just, like, keep moving. And what my therapist is trying to get me to do is realize that, like, some of the forms of anxiety I feel, that's a way of trying to stop me from feeling the fear or the sadness or the anger from it. Like, it's really weird. Like, it's so weird when, like, the far right get a hold of a photo of, like, me and my partner on holiday, and they construct these really elaborate narratives around it. Like, it's so weird. Like, people do this to you, and I've seen people do this to you as well. I'm just a bit like, I don't know why you're so interested in making me a character in your story. Like I fundamentally don't understand that drive. But
we've never met. Why do you care so much?
Yeah, why do you care? I suppose, like, my two responses to it really are, like, numb out, freeze out. But then the other is, I feel incredibly lucky to have a household that feels like a sanctuary. Like, I live with my husband and we live with our best friends as well. And we have a cat, and it feels like the most comforting, safe place in the world. And then we live in a neighborhood where loads of my friends live. And then I work for this organization where even when things are difficult, I'm like, oh my God, there's so much love here. And, like, the fact that, you know, I've known my colleagues for, you know, some of them more than 13 years now. It's like, I've become an adult with all of you. I think those are really important emotional safeguards for me, because it means that there are real feelings of safety, even though if I look on the internet, I'm like, oh shit, a lot of people want to kill me.
So does that mean that for you to have the kind of active political life you do, the intellectual life you do, the public facing stuff you do, by necessity, you have to have quite a relaxed, stable personal life?
I think so.
You'd have to. And if you didn't, the whole thing would just be so much more difficult.
I mean, I don't know if that's a product of the job or a requirement of the job or just getting a bit older. Like, you know, do you remember, like, being like 20 or 21 and it felt like being like, you know, a kind of a Formula One car that had managed to, like, zoom off the track and you're like, what the fuck is going on? How do I drive this thing? Like, that's what it's like being in your early 20s. And when you get to your 30s, you kind of go, my capacity for emotional self-regulation, these things are in my control. So I don't know if that's getting older or if it's the job.
Ash, been wonderful to talk to you. You should all buy this book immediately, or if it's not out yet, buy it on pre-order, I guess. This is not the cover. This is the cover, right?
Yeah, so actually it's a friend of mine called Archie Proudfoot who designed it, and I really, really like his work and his graphic design. And the thing that I said to him that I wanted was a shape and a set of colours that you could see from far away. So even if you can't read the words, you'd recognise what it was if you could see someone on the other end of the tube carriage reading it.
It is good. Maybe Novara, I don't think we had to buy the rights for it because Bloomsbury is a very big organisation. It would make a great poster. Ash, thank you so much for joining us on Downstream.
Thank you for having me.